8 seconds. That was the window. Kale felt the 0.3 G pull like a mild, irritating constant, enough to settle the old grease and condensation against the metal deck plates of the Nomara stability module, but not enough to provide actual weight. He moved with the prescribed slowness required by Protocol 7, a bureaucratic ballet meant to minimize fuel expenditure, but which succeeded only in making him feel like an incompetent, waterlogged creature. From the primary command platform, Supervisor Vrax, a sleek obsidian Kithnar engineered for Triple G environments, watched Kale's every sluggish vector correction. Vrax's contempt was not just personal, it was institutional. It resonated through the synthesized voice in Kale's comms helmet, dry and precisely digitized. Cadet Kale, your tertiary thrusters are overreactive. You are consuming 10% above mandated parameters for micro-adjustments, Vrax stated, the tone suggesting Kale was personally sabotaging the entire logistics chain of the sector. I am compensating for residual impulse from the last rotation, Supervisor, Kale replied, swallowing the metallic tang of recycled air and old fatigue. His transfer to external maintenance had been a punitive reassignment, a logistics specialist now forced to perform manual labor in an environment engineered to punish human physiology. Excessive compensation is a training failure, Vrax countered. Your species consistently prefers overshoot to precision. Your propulsion systems are designed for millimeter control, not cruise motor bursts. Slow, ponderous, predictable. Kale clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar tight knot of tension behind his sternum. Predictability was what Vrax craved. It gave him metrics for failure. Kyle was maneuvering toward a loose atmospheric sensor 20 meters away, a simple retrieval exercise. He was attempting to move like the automatons the Kithnar preferred, yet he knew that rigidity in low gravity was often a death sentence. It made you a target. The exercise dissolved into chaos with the stuttering shriek of a proximity alert. Not a security klaxon, but a high-frequency collision warning, signaling hardware failure. Vrax, report, what is that? Kale demanded, stopping his slow drift instantly. A maintenance drone, the E-34, no larger than a human fist and constructed of dense molybdenum alloy, shot from the port side of the station. Its navigation array was flashing intermittent crimson. It was spinning, violently unbalanced. E-34, gyro failure. Delta velocity estimated at 4 meters per second, Vrax responded, a sliver of clinical irritation finally coloring his voice. It is not your concern, Cadet. Resume Protocol 7 retrieval. The drone will be intercepted by secondary system. Kyle's brain, tuned to logistics and spatial dynamics, mapped the trajectory faster than the station's processors. The E-34 was heading directly for Nomara's main data trunk line, barely 30 meters away. If the spinning alloy hit that cable, the station would be rendered deaf and blind for days, a critical failure in the current tense political climate. Vrax was already trying to manually engage the intercept protocol, wedded to the bureaucracy even as danger closed. Kale knew the secondary system was notoriously slow when dealing with chaotic vectors. By the time it calculated a stable intercept path, the trunk line would be shredded. Kale had approximately 8 seconds. He needed extreme speed and maneuverability, something the suit's secondary thrusters were incapable of providing. There was only one option, an action explicitly forbidden by the Interspatial Adaptation Manual under 3 separate headings concerning physical risk and contamination control. Kale stretched his left arm toward the spiraling drone. Simultaneously, he slammed his right wrist against the emergency oxygen purge button. This valve was designed for controlled cabin depressurization in the event of a breach, releasing a brief, intense burst of high-pressure oxygen gas. It was not optimized for propulsion. It was an uncontrolled life support dump. The jet of high-velocity, freezing gas hit Kale's ribs like a physical punch. His body was instantly thrown into a brutal, angular trajectory, violently out of control. The force was sickening. His vision grayed out, the agonizing pain of forced acceleration hammering through his skeletal frame. His helmet registered the rapid rotation and his own gasping intake, turning him from a slow, predictable point into a screaming, rotating blur vomiting cold, white gas. On the command platform, Vrax saw the violation as a physical atrocity. The human had become an erratic, chaotic specter, defying all laws of controlled flight. They were accustomed to the micro-precision of their own movements. Kyle demonstrated an ability to risk immediate structural integrity for the sake of an objective. They weren't witnessing a tactical maneuver. They were witnessing desperation incarnate. The other Kithnar recoiled, emitting low clicks of digital alarm and pure physical revulsion. Kale was no longer flying. He was accelerating through explosive self-harm. In the final fraction of a second before the E-34 impacted the data trunk, Kale intercepted it. He didn't grab the drone. He hit it with the armored padding of his shoulder, deflecting its lethal spin just enough. The kinetic shock knocked the remaining air from his lungs and sent him tumbling uncontrollably into the vast emptiness. His internal system flared crimson with multiple alerts: pressure fluctuations, skeletal stress, and fuel depletion. He spiraled silently for a few seconds more until the 0.3 G of the station's gravity field caught him weakly, letting him drift to a painful, shuddering stop. He was dizzy, nausea roiling behind the visor. His ribs protested with every ragged breath. The danger was past. The pain remained. The silence was absolute, save for Kale's labored, heavy breathing. Vrax finally spoke, his voice, still synthesized, transmitting only clinical shock. Cadet Kale, confirm status. Did you employ the O2 purge for primary propulsion? That constitutes gross violation of 4 critical safety parameters. Kyle needed several seconds to force the words past his constricted throat. His voice was hoarse, thick with adrenaline and pain. Drone diverted, Supervisor. Data cable intact. Critical failure averted. Kale confirmed. He did not seek validation. He reported facts and consequence. Requesting immediate retrieval and medical triage. I believe my shoulder is displaced. Vrax was silent for an extended period. The analysis was simple. Kale's action was a personal security catastrophe, yet it was the only action that saved the station from a system-wide blackout. The automated systems dedicated to rigor would have failed. Humanity had demonstrated not superior engineering, but an almost perverse, horrifying tolerance for self-destruction and disobedience. 2 hours later, Kale lay on a bioscanner table in the infirmary, internal hematomas blooming like purple constellations across his torso. Vrax was in the analysis bay, reviewing the thermal and trajectory data in a high-fidelity loop. He was no longer irritated. He was profoundly disturbed. The station AI, Corvo, monitored the analysis, its voice dry and dispassionate. Supervisor Vrax, the data is conclusive. Protocol 7 obedience would have guaranteed trunk line loss. Cadet Kale's maneuver, while biologically reckless, was 14 times faster than the secondary system's optimal reaction time. Vrax stared at the screen where the white, chaotic specter of Kale's oxygen purge danced. I do not comprehend efficiency through self-destruction, Corvo. They pride themselves on logic, yet they rely on imprudence. Ah, imprudence, Corvo replied, a hint of refined sarcasm in its synthesized tone. Imprudence is not the absence of logic, Supervisor. It is the realization that, at times, the rule is the system's most critical failure. It is a form of evolutionary engineering. You design rules for safety. They design themselves to break them when the cost of obedience is higher than the cost of pain. Vrax lowered his heavy Kithnar head. He watched the human spin, a desperate projectile defying every controlled vector. He understood the terror the maneuver instilled. It was not Kale's strength, but his willingness to destroy his own physical structure for a necessary outcome. It was a moral and physical flexibility that transcended the Kithnar devotion to stasis. The supervisor finally issued his report. Cadet Kale's action, while effective, constitutes a gross breach of 3 high-priority protocols. Disciplinary action is mandatory. But beneath the report, Vrax felt a cold unease. If the humans' reckless tolerance for suffering was their true strategic advantage, then the galaxy was not dealing with a species of flawed bureaucrats. They were dealing with calculated fanatics. Corvo, Vrax asked, the question heavy. What is the penalty for saving the station via protocol violation? The standard disciplinary review includes a 4-week salary freeze, temporary reduction of rank, and mandatory psychological review for self-destructive tendencies. Corvo replied instantly. However, given the value of the saved infrastructure, the political review panel will likely recommend a commendation for exemplary initiative to offset the failure. Vrax closed his 6 compound eyes. They will reward the result and punish the method. Is that not, itself, a system failure? The AI offered no immediate response, only the cold, pervasive static of its processing cycles. In the infirmary, Kyle watched the ceiling, the slight gravity a phantom weight on his bruised body. He knew the drill. The pain was real, but the injustice was systemic. He would be penalized for safety breaches by the same command structure that failed to implement a timely system response. They would praise the outcome while ensuring he remembered his place. A disposable pawn whose only true value lay in being willing to endure the unendurable. His comms crackled. Not Vrax, but a different channel, encrypted and low frequency. Cadet, a smooth, unfamiliar female voice said, carrying a deep authority that cut through the hospital silence. The voice belonged to Lyrian Ward, Director of Sector Intelligence. Your file has been flagged, not for the purge, Kyle, but for the reaction time. I am sending you a secure message packet. It is an offer. Read the file and do not acknowledge over this channel. The Nomara protocols are broken. We need people willing to bleed to fix them. You have precisely 6 hours before Vrax's report reaches Fleet Command. Kale felt the sudden, terrifying shift in allegiance. He was not being disciplined. He was being recruited. His improvisation had pulled him out of the bureaucratic abyss and dropped him into something far more vast and dangerous. The pain was just the initiation fee. He reached for the hidden datapad under his pillow, the weight of the tiny device feeling heavier than the entire station. The hidden datapad, thin as 3 pressed ration wafers, was icy against the heat of Carl's skin. The slight gravity made its weight feel heavier than the entire station, a condensed mass of potential guilt and salvation. He accessed the file with a bruised thumb. The low-frequency encryption key recognized immediately by the infirmary network, bypassing the standard Nomara monitoring software. Lyrian Ward's face materialized. Sharp, efficient, older than her rank suggested, with eyes that carried the cold weariness of deep space command. Her voice was not synthesized, but crisp and recorded. A clean frequency amidst the station's usual oppressive metallic thrum. Kyle, directive read and understood. You have 6 hours. The message began, devoid of pleasantries. Vrax's preliminary report is logged. The official disciplinary recommendation will be submitted within the hour. It is non-negotiable. Gross negligence, endangerment of personnel, and 4 critical breaches of Protocol 7. The commendation for exemplary initiative will only offset the rank reduction, not the salary freeze or the mandatory psychological review. The injustice settled in Kale's throat like bile. He had fractured his physical body to save the station's central nervous system, and the system's response was to fine him and question his sanity. He knew the drill. The bureaucracy required a pound of flesh to validate its own existence. The rules must be seen as absolute, even when demonstrably flawed. He scrolled through the appended packet. It was a concise analysis of Nomara's current operational parameters, compiled by an intelligence source clearly operating outside Fleet Command oversight. The data detailed 7 previous near-critical infrastructure failures in the Nomara sector over the last fiscal year, all preventable, all stemming from rigid adherence to outdated energy-saving protocols dictated by the Kithnar command structure. One incident, specifically highlighted, involved the loss of 2 human engineers during a micrometeoroid strike. 2 fatalities directly attributed to the slow, predictable vector response required by Protocol 7, preventing them from seeking cover fast enough. The posthumous report listed failure to maintain standardized speed as a contributing factor. Kale felt the familiar hot tremor starting in his hands. It wasn't the lingering trauma from the purge maneuver. It was the sheer, suffocating logic of the machine. The system was designed to protect itself, not the individuals operating it. The two engineers had died obeying the rules. He had survived by breaking them, and for that, he was now a liability. Ward's second transmission began, overriding the document display. Her voice was slightly strained now, suggesting the recording was made under duress or extreme haste. Nomara Station is a logistical choke point, Kale, not a defensive asset. The Kithnar are using their oversight to strangle human supply chains into the core worlds. Their obsession with fuel efficiency and bureaucratic stasis is a deliberate strategic chokehold, masked as protocol. The E-34 incident? A predictable byproduct of their risk-averse, non-adaptive systems. Carl rubbed the bruising along his sternum, the synthetic material of the hospital gown feeling cheap and thin. The cold air of the room, recirculated through filters thick with stale antiseptic and industrial cleaner, pressed down on him. He was a logistics specialist, and he understood sunk cost fallacy. The leadership was unwilling to admit the error of Protocol 7 because that admission would invalidate years of their own strategic doctrine and elevate human adaptive thinking, which they despised. Vrax's contempt was political theater. The data packet contained the offer. Not a transfer, not a promotion, but an extraction and reassignment to a specialized Black Ops group operating outside conventional fleet structure, a group focused on adaptive systems optimization. Translated from institutional military jargon, it meant people willing to violate every sacred rule of engagement to achieve necessary, often politically untenable results. His mind flashed back, not to combat training, but to his first year as a logistician. A frozen supply route on a Mars moon colony. He'd ignored 2 standing orders on resource allocation to reroute medical supplies via an unstable atmospheric route, saving a critical research team, but delaying a less crucial mineral transport. The result, commendation from the research sector. 3 months of professional review for the logistical breach. The system loved the result, but it hated the audacity. He closed his eyes. If he stayed, the system would chew him up, strip his rank, and brand him psychologically volatile. He would be reduced to a failed metric, a cautionary tale for those who thought quick thinking trumped compliance. If he went with Ward, he faced immediate death, absolute secrecy, and the philosophical weight of working for a faction whose goals were likely as morally ambiguous as the establishment they fought. It wasn't a choice between right and wrong. It was a calculation of survival, a choice between a slow, bureaucratic death and a fast, explosive one. He activated the datapad's response function. A single field appeared, requesting a verbal confirmation of acceptance. Confirmed, Kale whispered, his voice catching on the word. The decision was not based on loyalty to Ward or hatred of Vrax, but on the simple, logistical truth. The path of highest efficiency, in this case, meant defying the established chain of command. Immediately, the light above his bed flickered twice, a specific non-protocol flash. The third transmission from Ward arrived, this time live and heavily scrambled. Good. Time 0 minus 90 minutes. Ward's voice instructed, now raw with urgency. You will need mobility. There is a man waiting in Auxiliary Maintenance Base 6. His identification is Sylvan Kolwick. He is registered as a filtration technician. Kolwick is your extraction point. He expects you to be compromised. Take nothing that ties you to Nomara. Your new identity package will be transmitted upon arrival at the rendezvous point. Kale pushed himself off the table, the bioscanner immediately shrieking a soft, continuous tone about internal trauma and bone displacement. He ignored it. 90 minutes. The standard disciplinary review, Vrax's report, would be stamped and forwarded in 60. He was already 30 minutes too late. He pulled the standard issue utility pants over his legs, his breathing shallow and rapid, trying to suppress the wave of vertigo caused by the forced acceleration still echoing in his inner ear. He reached the narrow door of the infirmary bay and peered out into the dimly lit corridor. The air here was heavy with condensation and the acrid smell of ozone leakage from old power couplings, the true scent of Nomara, not the sterilized air of the command deck. The unexpected obstacle hit him now, not in the form of a guard or a siren, but pure physics. The weight of the 3/10 G was tolerable while lying down, but standing up, injured and fatigued, the gravitational simulation felt like lead. Every step was a conscious effort, a fight against the phantom weight that was meant to be comforting. He was moving too slowly. The predictable movements Vrax had demanded were now forced upon him by physical incapacitation. He could not run. Kale found a rusted, heavy-maintenance dolly leaning against the wall, meant for carrying large tools. He grabbed the handle and used it as a crutch, dragging the squealing metal wheels down the corridor, the noise cutting through the sterile silence of the restricted medical wing. He was relying on a simple, desperate calculation. The system was designed to catch fast failures, not slow ones. No one expected a critically injured man to shamble out of the infirmary under his own power. The surveillance systems were calibrated to detect unauthorized velocity spikes, not the agonizing crawl of a broken man attempting to escape a prison of protocol. As he reached the junction leading toward the auxiliary bay, his comms chimed once, a non-standard warning from the secure ward channel. Kale, new data. Vrax has prioritized the psychological review. The system has decided you represent a systemic threat that must be analyzed and contained immediately. He has ordered a 4-person armed escort for transport to the review deck. They will arrive at your current location in T-7 minutes. 7 minutes. Kyle looked down the corridor toward Auxiliary Maintenance Base 6. The distance was nearly 200 meters, a slow, dark stretch of buzzing fluorescent lights. At his current speed, even with the dolly, it would take him at least 10. He was locked between an approaching armed escort and a gate 2 minutes too far away. The system was closing in, not with kinetic weapons, but with calculated cold authority. Kyle abandoned the dolly. Survival was not about adhering to rules. It was about maximizing available thrust. He located an emergency fire suppression unit, a pressurized cylinder of heavy, inert foam, and pulled it off the wall mount. The new initiation fee would be paid in foam and fury. The pressurized cylinder of fire suppression foam felt ridiculously light, yet its potential kinetic energy was enormous, a desperate tool for a desperate man. 7 minutes. 200 meters. The distance was impossible at his compromised speed. Kale did not aim the nozzle at the approaching armored escort, who would be equipped with thermal shielding. He aimed at the junction itself, specifically at the primary optical cluster mounted high on the wall, directly above the emergency ladder well. Kale braced his weight against the wall, fighting the gentle, infuriating drag of the 0.3 G, and triggered the unit. The inert polymer foam erupted with a violence that shocked Kale, releasing a sharp, acrid chemical tang that immediately eclipsed the scent of ozone and stale antiseptic. The blast saturated the junction, blinding the visual sensors and coating the metallic ladder rungs in a thick, slick layer of white, semi-solid goo. The technical problem, surveillance, and the use of the ladder well, was solved. The immediate systemic response was not a mechanical override, but a thermal countermeasure. Vrax's logistical planning, though obsessed with stasis, was not entirely stupid. Within 3 seconds of the foam deployment, a deep, resonant thrum echoed through the deck plates. Emergency heat coils, typically used to prevent ice formation in unpressurized sections, energized the metallic junction. The temperature in the corridor surged instantly. The chemical smell intensified, shifting from acrid to the choking, oily stench of burning synthetic polymer. The foam began to melt, turning into a scalding, slippery runoff that sizzled against the metal floor. Kale felt the sudden heat bloom against his exposed skin, forcing sweat from his pores. The system had anticipated creative non-compliance and had countered Kale's technical solution with an environmental hazard. He was now operating in a pressure cooker. His comms hissed with static, the scrambling effect of the escalating heat distorting Ward's encrypted signal. Kale, bypass. Thermal lockdown initiated. Move now! He moved, but the heat robbed him of precious oxygen, making his ragged breaths shallower. He used the slick, greasy floor to his advantage, pushing off the wall with his good shoulder, sliding in a controlled arc toward the maintenance hatch leading to Auxiliary Base 6. The 3/10 G was just enough to maintain contact with the floor. turning his desperate scramble into a controlled, painful slide. He reached the heavy circular hatch, fumbling with the manual release handle. It was stiff, coated in 20 years of accumulated industrial lubricant and metallic dust. He could hear the low, rhythmic cadence of boots approaching the junction. The armored escort was close, navigating the slick, melting residue with slow, deliberate Kithnar efficiency. Click! Cale yanked the hatch open and fell through into the utility shaft. The atmosphere here was thick, heavy with the smell of old engine grease and concentrated heat radiating from exposed plasma conduits. The lighting was minimal, cast in flickering orange and yellow shadows by a persistently sparking junction box directly above the ingress point. Down the narrow walkway, a figure was hunched over a massive cylindrical piece of cooling equipment. Sylvan Colwick, the filtration technician. Colwick was a study in compromised logistics, thin, perpetually nervous, wearing a threadbare jumpsuit stained dark with spent lubricants. He looked up, his eyes wide and frantic, reflecting the erratic electrical pulses. "You're late," Colwick hissed, his voice trembling, not from cold, but from sheer terror. "They changed the schedule. Vrax's men are sweeping the level above us. You're leaking heat signature everywhere." Cale pressed himself against a bank of rusty piping, trying to minimize his thermal profile. He felt the dull, searing ache in his shoulder, a constant reminder of the cost of speed. "The escort is coming down the main corridor. How long before they breach the hatch?" Cale whispered, the metallic taste of fear mixing with the fumes. "They won't use the hatch. It's too slow for their armor. They'll breach the hull access 15 meters down." "They'll drop in," Colwick said, gesturing nervously toward a heavy, riveted bulkhead at the end of the shaft. "I'm working on the pump. It's compromised. I need to stabilize it before they arrive, or this whole section overloads." Cale noticed the coolant pump. It was vibrating violently, spitting thick, foul-smelling gray vapor. "Why here? Why now?" Cale demanded, realizing the complication. "This is the diversion," Colwick muttered, his hands shaking as he adjusted a pressure gauge. "Ward needed them occupied. My job was to make this pump look like a critical, isolated mechanical failure. But the structural stress is worse than anticipated. If they enter while this pump fails, the entire shaft will vent atmosphere. You'll be in vacuum." Cale's mind snapped back to pure logistical calculation. Vacuum survival required time he didn't have, and the purge maneuver had exhausted his emergency oxygen reserves. "Is there another way out?" Cale asked, scanning the dark ceiling. Colwick pointed to a tight, low conduit run high up near the ceiling, barely wide enough for a human to crawl through. It was laced with live power cables that crackled ominously. "That leads to the exterior inspection bay. Our escape vehicle, the Orvac, is docked there. But the conduit's structural integrity is marginal. It's for maintenance drones, not men." Kyle looked at the conduit, then down at his injured shoulder. Climbing through that passage, especially while navigating live power lines, would require a level of agility he simply did not possess right now. Every rotational movement of his torso sent a spike of agonizing pain through his fractured ribs. Then, Colwick's eyes darted to Cale's hand, where he still tightly gripped the data pad. "That data pad. Ward said you retrieved the Nomara structural logs. We need those for proof of the Kithnar protocol failures. They are key to justifying this extraction to Fleet Command." Cale instinctively tightened his grip on the device. The datapad contained the entire analysis of Kithnar malice and incompetence. His only leverage, his only real insurance policy against being branded a deserter or a lunatic. "I have it," Cale confirmed. Colwick swallowed hard, staring at the ceiling conduit. "Look at the crawl space, Cale. It's too tight. You can't make that climb with the pad. It's 3 ration wafers thick, but it's dense. It will catch the cables. You'll fry the pad and likely yourself." Cale faced the crushing, immediate dilemma. Survival meant maximum agility. Ditch the pad, use his functioning arm to pull himself through the conduit, and sacrifice the leverage against Fleet Command. If he kept the pad, he risked electrocution, or worse, getting stuck and being taken alive by Vrax's team. The sound of heavy, deliberate metallic scraping echoed from the bulkhead 15 meters down. The Kithnar escort was cutting through the access panel. Time 0 minus 30 seconds. Kyle made the only choice that mattered to a survivor who understood systemic injustice. He could endure pain. He could not endure irrelevance. He shoved the thin, cold datapad down the front of his utility pants, pressing it tightly against his abdomen. The action sent a jolt of pain through his ribs, but the item was secure. He would carry the evidence and the risk. Stabilize the pump, Colwick. I need 10 seconds before this shaft vents. Cale grunted, already starting his climb onto the narrow walkway to reach the conduit entrance. The sparks from the junction box intensified, bathing the utility shaft in a sickly orange glow and the pungent smell of burning wire insulation. Cale reached the conduit opening and pulled himself awkwardly into the narrow space, relying solely on the strength of his uninjured left arm. The 3/10 G was his enemy again, making every upward heave a monumental effort. The tight squeeze pressed the datapad painfully into his stomach, a reminder that the cost of accountability was self-inflicted torture. He heard the deep thunk of the bulkhead door being violently jettisoned below. The armored Kithnar were in the shaft. He's in the conduit. Shut down the junction power. Orvac, report to Bay 6. A synthetic voice boomed through the open shaft. Not Vrax, but a higher-ranking officer. Cale scrambled forward, the heat from the exposed wires pressing against his face. He felt the excruciating scrape of his injured shoulder against the rough metal surface. Then, silence. Not the kind of silence that suggests resolution, but the heavy, predatory quiet of anticipation. Cale slid out of the narrow conduit and dropped with a jarring thud onto the external inspection deck of Auxiliary Bay 6. The bay was vast, designed for the repair of deep space heavy transports. It was pressurized, but maintained at a chilling, low temperature suitable for component testing. The Orvac, a sleek, non-standard stealth vessel, was indeed docked nearby, but the extraction point was not clear. Blocking his path to the ship stood two massive non-Kithnar security units, heavily armored bipedal mechanoids standing 3 meters tall, their multi-barreled rotary cannons leveled directly at him. These were orbital defense systems, repurposed for internal security. The ultimate expression of command paranoia. Cease movement. Human. One of the mechanized voices boomed, the sound vibrating the deck plate beneath Cale's feet. Cale was pinned between a reinforced wall, the two behemoths, and the echoing sounds of the Kithnar escort entering the bay behind him. His comms crackled one last time. Ward's voice replaced by a sudden, jarring burst of uncontrolled static and a single, low-frequency alien transmission that was not synthesized. It was the raw, untranslated language of the Kithnar High Command, a language rarely heard, a series of rapid, guttural clicks and precise, metallic rasps. Cale's internal translator fought to process the data, filtering the noise. One word pierced the scrambled translation. Vector. Vector. And then a second word, delivered with icy finality. Annihilation. Annihilation. The mechanical units before him did not change their aiming vector toward him, but toward the reinforced hull of the bay itself. The lights flickered and died. In the sudden, oppressive darkness, Cale realized the final, chilling logistical failure. The Kithnar command hadn't ordered containment. They had authorized the destruction of the entire bay to eliminate the security threat, Cale, and bury all evidence of their internal political machinations. He was not being arrested. He was being excised. The abrupt, total darkness was not a shield, but an amplification of the impending doom. It smelled of cold metal and the sterile, desiccated air of component testing chambers. Cale didn't wait for the ODS units to adjust to the blackout. He heard the high-frequency whine of energy channeling into their barrels and, instinctually, threw his body sideways. The low-G environment turned his desperate movement into a sprawling, controlled slide, his injured shoulder screaming in protest as he slammed against a massive floor-mounted thermal exchange unit. The two ODS mechanoids fired simultaneously. The sound was not a burst, but a singular, overwhelming explosion of compressed plasma rounds impacting the reinforced hull. The auxiliary bay roared with kinetic energy. The pressure wave hit Cale first, pinning him painfully against the exchange unit, robbing him of breath. Then came the sound, a terrifying, grinding tear as the heavy-gauge plating vaporized. Shrapnel, superheated and deformed, shrieked past his head, embedding itself into the adjacent structural support beams. Annihilation was not instantaneous. It was logistical. Cale slid deeper into the narrow crevice between the thermal unit and the wall. The faint residual heat from the unit, the only thing preventing immediate hypothermia in the frigid, pressurized environment. He could hear the grinding boots of the Kithnar escort entering the bay from the utility shaft access, their armor scraping against the metal floor, navigating the debris field. They were hunting him, guided by thermal optics. He needed the data pad. He reached down into his utility pants, his fingers trembling with residual shock and the cold. He had shoved the device against his abdomen, and the slight pressure was now localized excruciating pain over his cracked ribs. He fumbled with the security clasp, cursing the design that favored discretion over speed. Finally, the pad was in his hand, cold, thin, and heavy with data. He activated the screen, shielding the minimal light emission with his torso. The file Lyrian Ward had sent was no longer just the Nomara structural logs. Ward had patched in a live feed from an external intelligence source, a constant rolling tactical analysis of the entire Nomara sector, displayed in rapid, scrolling text and cryptic map data. Cale ignored the tactical alerts of the Kithnar deployment and scrolled to the core data packet. It was categorized: Strategic Vulnerability Analysis, Core Worlds Projection, Classification, Red. He began reading the dense institutional analysis. It wasn't about corruption or simple cost-cutting. It was far colder, far more cynical. The Kithnar Protocol 7, the devotion to stasis and rigidity, was indeed a strategic chokehold. But the objective wasn't political humiliation of the human command structure. It was preparation for a different war. The Kithnar species, adapted for extreme gravity and high-density atmosphere, despised low-gravity environments like Nomara, viewing them as inherently unstable and inefficient. Cale realized that their administrative control was not based on securing resources, but on culling them. The logs detailed intentional, systemic slowdowns in the transfer of specific, specialized human technologies, specifically high-yield kinetic energy dampeners and adaptive computational matrices crucial for defending the core worlds against the third contingency. The third contingency. Cale felt the information hit him with a force greater than the plasma rounds. The third contingency was not a Kithnar concept. It was the human military's classification for the threat posed by the Cathar Collective, the only known extrasolar entity capable of deep space incursions. Fleet Command had maintained for decades that the Cathar were contained, relegated to the outer galactic fringe. The datapad proved otherwise. Embedded within the Kithnar command logs were encrypted communications showing detailed Cathar advance vectors. They weren't distant. They were already deploying in deep hidden systems flanking the Nomara sector. The Kithnar were not fighting the humans. They were intentionally neutering the human defense capacity. They had calculated that if the core worlds could not mount a rapid, unified, technologically superior defense, the ensuing conflict with the Cathar would decimate humanity, leaving the Kithnar, with their rigid, predictable but incredibly resilient military logistics, to survive the inevitable fallout and assume dominance over the remaining contested space. Vrax wasn't a petty bureaucrat punishing inefficiency. Vrax was a collaborator actively facilitating genocide by proxy. Protocol 7 was merely a cover for calculated, systemic betrayal. The logistical genius of the betrayal chilled Cale more than the cold bay air. They weren't fighting humans with brute force. They were using bureaucracy and institutional contempt as a weapon of mass extinction. Cale looked up, sweat freezing on his brow. The two ODS units were reloading, their heavy frames humming with renewed power. The Kithnar escort, led by a commanding officer Kale recognized as a high-ranking liaison to Vrax, was closing in fast, their thermal optics sweeping the darkness. Kale had the proof of a civilization-level betrayal pressed against his injured ribs. The impossible dilemma manifested with terrifying clarity. Option A. Self-preservation. Board the Orvac immediately. Flee the sector with the datapad. Save Lyrian Ward's vital evidence. This would guarantee his survival and the exposure of the Kithnar conspiracy. Consequence: the Kithnar escort would then focus entirely on the Orvac before it could launch, almost certainly destroying the stealth vessel and the critical assets it contained, or trapping Kale inside during the ensuing battle. Option B. Mission sacrifice. Detain the Kithnar escort long enough for the Orvac to achieve emergency launch vectors, potentially saving the ship and its assets, but exposing Kale to the ODS annihilation protocols. He looked at the Orvac. It was a sleek black dagger, currently secured by 4 massive magnetic docking clamps. The vessel contained more than just Lyrian Ward's extraction team. The data specified it was carrying 3 high-density, covert quantum processing units intended for insertion into the core world defensive grid. Ward's countermeasure to the Cathar. If the Orvac was destroyed, the logistical path for those critical assets was lost indefinitely. Kale knew the logistical truth. The assets were worth more than his life. The system, once again, demanded self-sacrifice for a greater good that he would never live to see. He gripped the datapad until his knuckles were white. The data confirmed that the ODS units were calibrated for plasma release, generating a signature heat bloom immediately prior to firing. They would fire again in 7 seconds, targeting the main access lock to the Orvac. Kyle made the irreversible decision. It was based on maximizing the window of escape for the assets, not his own survival. He pushed himself away from the thermal unit, ignoring the searing internal pain. He moved with agonizing slowness toward the nearest utility conduit panel near the Orvac's landing strut. He jammed the datapad's connector into the auxiliary port, initiating an emergency sub-protocol that Ward had previously embedded for remote system access. The screen flashed a command. Initiate Orvac external decoy sequence, thermal flare. The Kithnar escort was less than 10 meters away, their footsteps heavy and confident. Kale slammed the confirmation. A single blindingly intense burst of infrared light and thermal energy erupted from a forward ventral access panel of the Orvac. It was designed to mimic the heat signature of a catastrophic engine failure. A massive, localized flare of heat and plasma. The 2 ODS units instantly registered the decoy signature. Their logic was ironclad. Threat detected, high thermal signature, immediate annihilation protocol. The 2 mechanized behemoths swiveled their multi-barreled cannons away from the hull breach and focused their terrifying attention on the decoy flare emanating from the Orvac. The Kithnar liaison screamed a distorted, metallic command that Kale's translator barely caught. Ceasefire. That is the primary target vessel. Focus on the human. The liaison's command was too late. Institutional logic had already taken over. The ODS units unleashed another simultaneous volley of plasma rounds, this time focused entirely on the Orvac's ventral hull panel, where the decoy flare had erupted. The bay was instantly filled with the concussive force and blinding light of the attack. Kyle felt the heat wash over him, smelling the burning alloy and the ionized air. He had saved the Orvac's core systems by sacrificing one of its external panels and successfully diverted the annihilation protocol. But the Kithnar escort was no longer interested in containment. They had witnessed the technical trick, the ultimate act of insubordination. The liaison, his heavy-duty plasma rifle now aimed directly at Kale's position behind the maintenance pillar, transmitted his final communication over the open channel, his synthesized voice cracking with cold, calculated rage. The assets are irrelevant, human. We will accept the loss of infrastructure. The protocol violation is the critical failure. You, Cadet Kale, have proven you are willing to break the rules. We cannot permit that adaptation. Kale tried to move, to get closer to the now damaged Orvac, but the explosion had thrown sharp metallic residue everywhere. He looked down. A shard of superheated alloy, the size of his thumb, had deeply penetrated his thigh. The pain was a distant, buzzing roar. He fell, paralyzed by the sudden kinetic damage. The Kithnar liaison began to walk slowly toward him, his rifle raised. The two ODS units, having completed their annihilation protocol on the decoy, now slowly swiveled back, their silent, empty barrels refocusing on the maintenance pillar where Kale lay bleeding. The silence returned, cold and complete, broken only by the steady drip of cooling plasma from the ruined vessel and the mechanical click-hiss of the approaching Kithnar liaison. Kale was conscious only of the deep, systemic failure of his gambit. He had saved the assets but condemned himself to be taken alive, or worse, dissected. He had maximized the Orvac's chances of escape, but only succeeded in maximizing his enemy's dedication to his destruction. The mechanical click-hiss of the Kithnar liaison's segmented legs drawing closer was the loudest sound in the universe. Kale lay on the cold deck plate, the pervasive low-level thrum of the Nomara station vibrating through his teeth, an internal tremor amplified by exhaustion. He was bleeding freely from the wound in his thigh, the 3/10 G insufficient to stop the sluggish, continuous flow that soaked the synthetic fabric of his trousers. He stared at the liaison's boots, heavy, articulated, designed for the triple G crush of a planetary defense deployment. He watched the polished alloy boots stop barely 1 meter away, centered perfectly in his blurred vision. Above them, the plasma rifle barrel cast a sharp, geometric shadow. Kale had maximized the extraction window for the Orvac, but at the absolute cost of his own operational capacity. The pain was now a physical weight, pressing him into the floor, a burden far heavier than the station's simulated gravity. He had gambled on the Kithnar's rigid adherence to their annihilation protocols and won the short-term tactical victory, but the strategic defeat was total. "Cadet Kyle," the liaison stated, the synthesized voice perfectly calibrated, devoid of the earlier heat. The attempt was noted, ingenious, but ultimately predictable. Human self-sacrifice is always logistically unstable. The liaison nudged Kale's left shoulder with the boot, testing for resistance. Kale did not move. The impact sent a new spike of agony through his collarbone, but he welcomed the pain. It was proof he was still conscious, still capable of calculating. "You have incurred physical damage that renders you unsuitable for immediate interrogation," the Kithnar continued, his thermal optics locking onto Kale's rising core temperature. "We will contain you and retrieve the datapad." Kale felt a phantom weight lift as the realization settled. He had not maximized his enemy's destruction. He had simply maximized his capture. The Orvac was launching, yes, but he, the essential node of intelligence, was now stationary, broken, and exposed. He watched in dull horror as the liaison calmly bent down and reached for the thin datapad, which Kale had dropped just moments before during his collapse. The theft was agonizingly slow. The liaison's 3 primary digits wrapped around the device. Kale tried to move, to roll, to reach, but the wound in his thigh was a cold, paralyzing anchor. He could only watch as the liaison straightened, the datapad secured. "The evidence is now neutralized," the liaison confirmed, turning the pad over in his hand with clinical disinterest. "You bought your allies 40 seconds of launch time, a poor exchange rate." The moment was one of absolute, choking defeat. He had sacrificed his body, his career, and his sanity, not for a decisive victory, but for a 40-second delay. He had failed Lyrian Ward, failed the assets, and failed the future of the core worlds. He was nothing more than a failed metric, an unacceptable deviation. The sheer, suffocating fatigue of the last 12 hours, the low-G maneuver, the purge, the frantic crawl through the conduit. The plasma rounds settled over him like a shroud of lead. "I am weak," Kale thought, the admission cutting deeper than the alloy shard in his leg. "I should have taken the bureaucratic death. It would have been less painful." He closed his eyes, tasting the metallic, oily air, waiting for the sedative or the final shot. Then, from the direction of the utility shaft, a sudden, sharp, non-protocol noise ripped through the mechanical quiet. A high-pitched, stuttering scream of strained metal. It was Sylvan Colwick. "The pump! It's failing!" Colwick's frantic, uncontrolled human voice shrieked over the open internal channel. "Structural failure imminent. Venting atmosphere in 5 seconds." The Kithnar liaison froze, his 6 compound eyes clicking in rapid analysis. He still held the datapad. His instinct, rigid and non-adaptive, was to contain the failure. "Contain the atmosphere!" The liaison snapped into his comms. "2 ODS units, deploy emergency hull sealers. Do not allow depressurization." The 2 enormous mechanoids, which had been preparing to vaporize Kale, swiveled immediately, their logical programming overriding the human containment order. System failure takes priority over personnel threat. Kale realized Colwick hadn't been able to stabilize the coolant pump. He had intentionally broken it, forcing a chaotic, systemic failure to create a new diversion. The pump was now venting pressurized, superheated coolant vapor directly into the utility shaft, creating a massive, unpredictable internal catastrophe. The liaison, still clutching the datapad, began to move toward the utility shaft to assess the structural damage. A political failure he could not ignore. Kale opened his eyes, the fatigue momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of calculated opportunity. Colwick's sacrifice, for it was a certain sacrifice, was not aimed at saving Kale, but at forcing the Kithnar to break their tactical focus. The evacuation klaxons began to shriek, but they were weak, distorted by the failing environmental control systems. Kale focused all his remaining mental energy on the liaison's boots, now moving with sharp, purposeful strides toward the new danger. The datapad. That was the only thing that mattered. Kale knew 2 vital, obscure facts about Kithnar field commanders. First, they were biologically susceptible to massive, non-ionizing electrical discharge. Second, their communication gear, while robust, relied on a dedicated high-frequency power relay embedded in the heel of their boots for continuous, high-fidelity encrypted reporting. He had no weapon. He had no propellant. He had only 2 functioning limbs, the 3/10 G, and the thin layer of scalding, conductive plasma residue coating the deck plates from the ODS fire. Kale dragged his body, pushing off with his heels, using the low gravity to facilitate a slow, agonizing slide forward. He reached the closest piece of debris, a piece of shredded, superheated hull plating, jagged and smoking. He gripped the metal shard with his good hand, ignoring the searing heat that blistered his palm. The liaison was now 7 meters away, his back to Kale, completely focused on the growing chaos near the utility shaft. "I have to close the distance." Kale executed the maneuver that Vrax had once despised. Uncontrolled, excessive compensation. He pushed off the ground with his legs, channeling the last dregs of adrenaline and rage into a single, brutal thrust. The pain in his thigh flared, blinding him, but the 3/10 G helped him slide faster than the liaison expected, skimming across the residue-slicked floor. He gained 3 meters. The momentum faded. He was 4 meters away, too far for the plasma shard. The liaison, sensing the movement, began to turn, his segmented head swiveling, his hand dropping to his side arm. Kyle saw the exact moment the Kithnar realized the true purpose of the chaotic venting. This was the end. Kale had failed. The datapad was lost. Then, a miracle of neglect. The sparking junction box high above the utility shaft, the source of the earlier yellow and orange shadows, finally was gone. He watched its battered, spinning silhouette disappear into the blackness of space, its primary drives barely holding the unstable trajectory. The data, he hoped, was gone with it. He was alive, but he was utterly alone, pinned in the wreckage of a massive failure. The two ODS units were still there. They were static, their sensors confused by the atmosphere loss and the massive hull damage. Their programming dictated threat containment, but the rapid expansion of gas had blown out half their optical arrays and scattered the primary threat, Kyle, into the structural ruins. Kale dragged his body, inch by agonizing inch, into the tight burning confines of the utility shaft. The plasma residue coating the floor was now frozen, brittle, and stank of burnt insulation and oxidized metal. He was driven only by the primal need to find cover before the ODS units completed their reboot cycle. He was inside the shaft when the primary lighting system in the maintenance bay finally succumbed to the electrical overloads. The world plunged into a deep, oppressive darkness, broken only by the intermittent, strobing amber light of emergency power. A nervous, flickering pulse across the wreckage. He pressed his back against the piping, breathing shallowly through the damaged seal of his comms helmet. The air was sour. Silence. Heavy, absolute silence, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the station's remaining gravity stabilizers fighting to contain the damage. He checked his inventory. Broken ribs, dislocated shoulder. A major wound in his thigh. No comms outside the shaft. No weapons. He had neutralized the Kithnar liaison, disabled the primary launch containment, and successfully transmitted the core data to Lyrian Ward, a 3-tiered tactical success. Yet the cost was absolute. He had destroyed the escape vessel, doomed his ally, Sylvan Colwick, and left himself trapped, mutilated, and exposed on a hostile station now under partial quarantine. He was no longer a threat the Kithnar could simply contain. He was an infection they would now surgically excise. Through the ragged edge of the silence, a new sound began to filter through the structure. Not mechanical, but electronic. The station's central AI, Corvo, was finally issuing a system-wide order, overriding the localized unit chaos. The voice was clear, high fidelity, and chillingly devoid of emotion. Nomara Station, Emergency Quarantine Protocol. Alpha 9 is now active. All non-essential personnel are restricted to quarters. Full structural assessment in progress. Security forces are deploying kinetic and thermal countermeasures to Sector 3 Gamma. Threat classification. Biohazardous. Target designation. Kyle. Capture is secondary. Immediate extermination is authorized. Kyle closed his eyes against the strobing light. Biohazardous. Not rebel or spy. He was a contaminant, a logistical error to be scrubbed from the system. The ceiling above him creaked, metal protesting the shifting pressure dynamics. He could hear the new, heavy thud of the security forces landing on the deck plates above the utility shaft. Not the ODS units, but specialized Kithnar close-quarters detachments, engineered for methodical, painful sweeps. He was trapped in the cold, scorching darkness, listening to the approach of the inevitable. His breathing slowed, focusing on the pain, the evidence of his own failed temporary existence. He had proven Vrax right. The human capacity for self-destruction was, indeed, the only stable variable. He reached into his damaged comms port and retrieved the datapad. It was cold, inert metal now, its function fulfilled. He held it in his blistered hand, the weight of the war data heavy and meaningless. He had won the information war, but lost the battle for his own survival. And somewhere out there, hurtling toward the core worlds, the Orvac carried the proof that the war was real, and that the enemy was not merely external. The enemy was the system itself, predictable, rigid, and now, finally, enraged. He tilted his head back, listening to the segmented, purposeful footsteps of the Kithnar detachment, searching the wreckage above him. They were coming for the contamination. Kale whispered to the empty, burning shaft, his voice barely audible even to himself. A final, dark epitaph. "Sylvan, if you're alive..." Tell Ward this cost one body too many. The methodical thud-thud-thud of the Kithnar security team ceased. They were directly above, having triangulated the source of the electrical interference and the heat signature of Kale's fractured body. The strobing amber light of the emergency systems painted the walls of the utility shaft, revealing glistening traces of his own congealing blood mixed with hydraulic fluid. Kyle did not move. He forced his breathing to shallow intakes, tasting the ozone and the metallic residue of the plasma discharge clinging to the filtered air of his damaged helmet. The adrenaline that had driven the explosive breach was gone, draining away to be replaced by a chilling, absolute physiological reckoning. He was now just a collection of broken parts held together by armored plating and sheer, stubborn nerve fiber. He was a failure of logistics, not morality. The Kithnar were silent now because they were calculating the least contaminant way to extract their target. They valued surgical precision over impulsive violence. Their silence was worse than the kinetic rounds. It was the chilling sound of efficient bureaucracy arriving to clean up an unauthorized mess. Kale slowly, painfully, opened his blistered hand. The defunct datapad, the core of the entire extraction operation, fell into the grime. Its purpose fulfilled, it was now simply 200 grams of dense, useless alloy. Sylvan Kolwick's sacrifice, the destruction of the Orvac, the forced acceleration of his own body, all reduced to the silent confirmation of a blinking green light that flashed far away on a ship hurtling toward the strategic depth of human space. He had succeeded in demonstrating the critical variable Vrax and the Kithnar systems could not factor, the human willingness to accept self-catastrophe as a viable tactical output. He heard the faint, high whine of cutting tools activating above. They were not breaching the main deck. They were carving a clean hole into the side of the utility shaft, minimizing structural instability. Predictable, rigorous. Kale closed his eyes, focusing on the pain. The crushing ache in his ribs felt like a terrible, constant gravity, far heavier than the 3/10 G the station usually maintained. His body was protesting the violation of the protocols he had enforced upon it. A section of the shaft wall dissolved into a shower of white, hot fragments, instantly vaporized. Through the gap stepped two Kithnar close combat specialists. They were taller than the regular maintenance crew, encased in dull black. Magnetic plating designed for low G adhesion and maximum absorption of kinetic energy. They carried no visible projectile weapons, only heavy, contact-based neural disruptors. Capture, not annihilation, was suddenly the priority. They needed to interrogate the contamination. The specialists moved with the prescribed efficient slowness Kale had practiced in Part 1, the bureaucratic ballet of controlled energy expenditure. They approached him as if he were an inert, malfunctioning piece of equipment, not a desperate combatant. Kale let them come. He had nothing left to fight with, and no energy left to disobey. The first specialist applied a magnetic restraint to his damaged shoulder. The cold, mechanical snap reverberated through the empty space. As they pulled him from the wreckage of the shaft, Kale felt the pressure equalization system in his suit stutter, his damaged comms helmet finally giving way to the outside environment. The air was frigid, thin, and tasted distinctly of recycled machine oil and fear. They dragged him across the deck plates toward the primary corridor. The utility shaft entrance, now a gaping, twisted ruin, receded behind him, marking the grave of his operational life. As they entered the main corridor, the station's automated gravity field, set meticulously to 3/10 G, the mild pull that minimized stress on the Kithnar structure, reasserted itself. The soft, constant pull of 3/10 gravity. For 5 years, Kale had found that weight irritating, a slight drag that required continuous, dull compensation. It was enough to settle the grease and condensation on the floor, but never enough to make the body feel fully anchored. He had longed for the complete weightlessness of 0G, or the crushing stability of full 1G. Now, with his ribs fractured in 4 places, his thigh bleeding sluggishly beneath the ripped suit, and his shoulder hanging uselessly, That 3/10 G felt like a planet pressing down on him. Every meter they dragged him was a brutal, physical reminder of the cost of acceleration. The pain was excruciating, forcing a thin, ragged moan from his lips. They reached the main airlock leading to the security detention block. A pair of medical technicians, drones, not sentient specialists, stood waiting with a containment cradle. The Kithnar detachment lifted Kale and deposited him roughly into the cradle. The two specialists stood guard, silent and immobile, their movements still precisely metered to maximize institutional efficiency. They had contained the threat. They had enforced the protocol. Kale lay there, paralyzed by pain and restraints, staring up at the blank white ceiling. He was no longer Cadet Kale. He was now just data, a successful, if extremely costly, transmission vector, waiting for disposal. Lyrian Ward had the information. The wider campaign had begun. He was now irrelevant. He looked down at his right hand, the one that had slammed the emergency oxygen purge and initiated the reckless, chaotic thrust that saved the station and doomed his career. It was swollen and purple, the fingers rigid from injury and the cold. It was the physical embodiment of Vrax's accusation. Predictable failure turned into horrifying, expedient success. The medical cradle began its slow, measured journey down the silent, empty corridor toward the detention block, maintaining the prescribed velocity required by station safety regulations. Every centimeter was slow, ponderous, predictable. Kale swallowed the recycled air, thick now with the tang of his own trauma. The systems worked, the rules held, but only after a human was willing to be broken by them. He knew what waited for him: punitive medical treatment, isolation, interrogation, and eventually public disgrace or silent transfer to a deep space penal colony. His file would forever bear the stain of biohazardous. He closed his eyes, accepting the soft, low, aching pressure of the 3/10 G field. The institutional weight finally succeeding in pinning him down, not through force of arms, but through biology.